Thank you for listening to the Speaking Out on Sex Abuse podcast with hosts Clara and Jimmy Hinton. If you're new to the podcast, please look us up on your favorite podcast app, subscribe, like, and share so that you never miss an episode. If you'd like to further support us, visit patreon.com/speakingout and check out the different rewards. You'll find exclusive rewards if you sign up as a patron of the podcast. Thank you for your support, and let's get into the show. Welcome to this week's podcast. Thank you to our patrons who make the podcast possible. It's good to be back in the saddle, huh?
It really is, yeah.
We missed last week. I was so sick. Oh my goodness. I had a stomach bug that I don't wish on anybody, and I got it. Let's see. We record on Tuesdays.
Right.
I got it on Monday really bad, and so I called you.
Yes, you
and
did.
I was strapped to bed, and she said, "Well, I don't really want to get it."
Is that on?
We're on.
Okay.
Granny
I'm sorry. I just pointed to something. It said stop recording, and it's lit in blue. Wanted to make sure we're recording. Yeah.
And the reason is because we recorded half an episode the last time and didn't realize that it wasn't recording. So,
yeah, Jimmy, I can't remember you being that sick in a long time where you've had to actually miss something. And
it was
where
bad.
You stayed weak.
Yeah.
For that long. So I'm glad to have you back.
I was 3 days in bed. It's good to be back.
Good to have you back.
So today we want to talk about some interesting statistics on prisons here in the United States. We've talked about the prisons and kind of what's going on with sex offenders being released from prisons, but we want to talk about specific details about the prison population in the United States. These actually were surprising statistics to me, and I don't know why. I just never really looked that deeply into these statistics, but they kind of paint a story. So that's what we want to share with you today. This comes from a website called worldpopulationreview.com. We will link to it in the description of this episode. And they rank prison population in the United States by number of prisoners per 100,000 residents. They rank the top 10, and I thought this was interesting. Alaska, by far, ranks as number 1.
I'm not getting that. I wonder what the crimes are in Alaska.
I don't know. Maybe people are stealing moose.
Well, I'm laughing, but it could very well be something like that. But
I don't know.
Just struck me as odd that, when I think of Alaska, I think of this remote place and where there's not a lot of congregated people in one big city, and where you would think crime would be a bit lower.
Yeah.
But I guess not.
Yeah, it's very bizarre. But here are the top 10 in order from most prisoners per 100,000 people. Alaska 1, Mississippi 2, then Louisiana, Oklahoma, Arkansas, Arizona, Alabama, Delaware, Texas, and then Georgia. So those are the top
the South.
10.
Isn't that
a lot in the South? Yep.
Well, and I'm thinking, I wonder if that has to do with the border, with people crossing the border, with drug infiltration.
Yep.
All of that. When you look at that, that probably has
that is
greatly
interesting.
affected that.
Yeah, I'm looking at the. They have a color coordinated map here, and I'm looking down here along the bottom in your right. Right. Arizona, Oklahoma, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama,
across,
Georgia, and that's Interstate 10 is the corridor that runs across from east to west. I used to drive truck across there a lot, and I always heard that was a main trafficking vein for both human trafficking and drugs, and that would make sense.
It does, yeah.
That would make sense.
As you look at that map. Delaware, I'm not quite sure why, but...
That's near Washington, D.C.
Yeah, I was going to say... well,
it's politicians that are in prison in Delaware.
Yeah.
But anyway, that I thought that was interesting. Another thing that surprised me... Well, no, let me start with this. About 25% of all of the world's total prison population is in the United States.
That's crazy,
Yeah.
isn't it?
Um,
We are a speck on the world map.
mm-hmm.
And to think that we have 1/4 of the entire prison population is
Yeah,
kind of scary,
it is.
isn't it? Yeah.
What else is interesting too is that I expected a lot more numbers. I thought we would have just millions of
Oh,
prisoners
I
in the
did
United
too.
States.
Yeah.
We don't. We have just over 1 million people incarcerated in state prisons in the United States.
And that's
Just over a
weird,
million.
that isn't it? Which kind of says what's going on. Are our laws that loose? Do we just not have much criminal activity? Do we release people from prison very fast? What's going on?
Well, I mean, if you think about it, we have 25%. We have a quarter of the world's population of prisoners. And we only have 1 million people incarcerated in the United
It's not
States.
very many.
So it goes to show in the world, there's a lot of crime. We know there's a lot of crime, but there aren't that many people who wind up in prison.
No.
And I think that's the point.
It's a
Is
scary
that
point.
the overwhelming majority, the vast majority of people who are either convicted of crimes or accused of crimes will never wind up in prison. And I think we can't overstate that.
Yeah.
There's another interesting trend, and I think you're right. You talked about this too. There's a decrease in the number of inmates, a dramatic
Right.
decrease in the number of inmates that we have in our prisons. I thought our prisons, I just assumed because you hear about California, there's been an overpopulation in
That
their
they're
prisons.
bulging at the seams with overload. Yeah.
And I
right.
assumed that was the case in all of our states
No.
where prisons are just being overpopulated. But actually, they put up another interesting graph, and this is a chart, and they show Alaska is the only state out of 50 states where the change total from 2019 to 2020 increased, and it only increased by 103 inmates, 2.3%.
That is so weird.
The rest of the states lost. Listen to these numbers. Anywhere from 10% to, I see 17%, 20%. And listen to these numbers. These are number of inmates that they lost from 2019 to 2020. And that doesn't mean that they replaced them. That means
They
prison population
went down.
decreased
Right.
by these amounts. Mississippi, 1,840 inmates. Louisiana, 4,645 inmates. Let's look at another. Texas, 22,523
Wow.
inmates less
Wow.
in 1 year's time
Wow.
in their state prisons. Here's another big one. Florida, almost 15,000 less inmates in 2020 than they had in 2019. On and on and on. And here, California, 25,359. Now, we know, because we've barked up this tree before, that a lot of the states were, Pennsylvania was one of the worst offenders. So Pennsylvania, New York, California, I think were the three biggest offenders,
Yeah.
where they were releasing sex offenders and sometimes violent sex offenders during the whole COVID pandemic. But the other thing that I think is really significant that's reducing these numbers, and I actually agree with it, is they're eliminating people who were there on petty drug crimes.
Right. Yeah. The legalization of pot has really, I think, attributed to these numbers where
Yeah.
people were being held in prisons for lengthy terms. Some of them, I remember reading back years ago where first offenders were put in for life in some states. And I used to just shudder thinking that is insane.
Yeah.
That didn't happen to murderers.
And for marijuana, not
Right.
even for
Oh,
hard
yeah.
drugs.
No,
It was for
pot.
marijuana, yeah.
For marijuana. So I'm thinking we're seeing those numbers, but we also know when that many people get released, there is going to be an influx of crime because they need jobs, they need homes, they need places to stay, something to do. And what happens? they'll be on our streets until that time. There's not enough help to get them placed in jobs. And man, oh day, we're not talking a couple hundred people. We're talking thousands upon thousands of people.
Well, look at the
So
difference in population just from 2019 to 2020. You're at over 200,000 inmates that have been turned out into the streets
that's
in the United States.
wild to me. That it really is.
So, integrating people back into society is a chronic issue. And that's why we're talking about it again. We've talked about it in different ways, but, I think this has to be on our radar because at the same time, I thought this was kind of interesting. I looked up what percentage of the prison populations are sex offenders, registered sex offenders, or people who will get a designation as a sex offender, and that includes your violent sex offenders, your you have your rapist, your child abusers, and on and on and on. That includes all of them. So in federal prison, it's only 11.6% of the federal prison population
Which is
are
crazy
sex
low,
offenders.
isn't it? Yeah.
In the state prisons, I couldn't find a figure, but I remember seeing it before, and it's about the same. It's about 10% of our prison population in the state prison are sex offenders. So out of 1 million, you're not talking a massive amount of the prison population. But these numbers get really skewed when you look at the total number of, or estimated total number of people in the sex offender registry in the United States. 780,000 people on the sex offender
That's
registry.
crazy. Yeah.
Almost equal to the number of inmates that we have in
Crazy.
all of our
Yeah.
prisons in the United
Crazy.
States.
Yeah.
And only 10%, only 10% of those in prisons are sex offenders. And so there's this big discrepancy, which tells me typically, very typically, sex offenders are spending light sentences in prison. They're being turned out constantly.
Oh, we know that for a fact. Yeah.
And why this should be on our radar is, one, these are only the people who've been caught. And it takes a tremendous amount of resources, of time, of money, of victims who are strong enough to be able to report or accidental reports, disclosures. It takes a tremendous amount of effort to actually turn people in, to follow through, to get a conviction, and to get a sentence.
You know, when we stop to think about it, this whole picture is frightening. It truly is. When a person goes into prison, say for alcohol-related manslaughter, they were drunk driving, they killed someone, they'll go through remediation, and when they come out, chances are pretty good that person's going to have some sort of reform. But when a sex offender goes in, we know, data proves it, that they do not come out reformed. So they come out smarter,
Right.
street smarter. They
Exactly.
come out right.
And with the full protection of churches.
Exactly
That say,
right.
well, it's not fair. It's not fair to let people know that they're on the
to
registry.
label them, to set them apart.
They've been
to-
forgiven, so let's do these covenant agreements.
Right.
So you're right.
And it's frightening when you think about that, because they are now out in public once again, out among our children, and they've got a protective umbrella over them because they have served their time, so to speak. And that's not even talking about the early release ones, ones that didn't even, serve their full term. The remediation is lacking, as you know. Think about what sex offenders go through in their classes.
Yeah.
You know, it's not what we would think, a retraining of the mind or whatever, and they will do anything compliance-wise to get out of prison. So we have all of these criminals now, and I will call them criminals because that's what they are, walking the streets with our children.
Yeah.
It is enough to make us shudder. It really is.
And once again, I mean, we're in no better position when people are on the sex offender registry than when they weren't, because we don't know if they have the protection of churches and of the public or just an uninformed public. People aren't checking the registry very often. I check it at least once a month.
Do you?
Absolutely, I do.
Have not.
If we're not informed, there's no way to tell who the convicted, again, these are people who've been convicted.
Right.
We don't know who these convicted sex offenders are, repeat offenders. And so it becomes really challenging because there's a multifaceted problem that's going on. You talked about this umbrella of protection that sex offenders have, and I agree wholeheartedly, especially in the churches. Especially in the churches.
Yep.
They get special treatment. They get secrecy. They get the benefit of having community without that community knowing that they're on the sex offender registry. The leaders protect them. They shield them. That's more often than not. And at the same time, ironically, they find it exceptionally challenging to find jobs because of their past. So secretly, privately,
Right.
they're not finding employment or they're not finding good employment. And, because that's stuff that you can't really hide from an employer, at least very easily.
Right. Right.
So, this leads to all kinds of issues because now you have...
sex offenders with time.
What does the scripture call them? Busybodies. Yeah, busybodies
Yep.
who have nothing but time on their hands.
Right.
They, oftentimes they have cell phones, they have social media. I verified this with my own fingertips calling a prison recently. I called a prison and I said, there are these sex offenders. We did an episode on, maybe it was when we did our training on looking up offenders, and we showed how broken that system is and the registry is.
Right.
But I said, here are these sex offenders that have sometimes 3, 4, 5 different social media profiles.
Right.
And they're fresh out of prison.
Right.
You know what I was told?
Yeah.
Well, there's no rule against it. Once they're out of prison, they can do whatever they want. Unless they're on parole or probation and they have terms of that parole and probation. Otherwise, they can have social media all day long. They can scour for photos of kids. They can befriend kids. Kids have to be 13 to be on social media.
And
there is literally nothing legally that stops prisoners, registered sex offenders from doing that.
Some people might think we're being a bit too harsh about this or too extravagant in our thoughts. It's hard for us, Jimmy, to imagine people who are so intently focused on the idea of harming children that they would spend all their time researching, planning, manipulating, carrying out these acts, these heinous acts. But it's the truth. And I think that's where we get hung up so much of the time. We kind of, it's like when we hear about a big earthquake killing 22,000 people, something like that, it's too big. And so we don't connect with it. When we hear about the person being hit by a car 2 blocks from us and we knew that person, then we connect. But the big picture is hard to connect with because we just don't think like that. And we don't think of these hordes of people being released from prisons and they've got time, just bukus of time on their hands. Where do they congregate a lot of the times? A lot of the times they'll volunteer because they're not getting jobs. They'll volunteer at schools or try to volunteer with sports programs, volunteer at churches. And, because that's a wonderful way to slide right back into the playground, so to speak.
Well, and if you look on a map, look at where they end up locating. We've talked about this before. They wind up very near schools.
Right.
So just behind our our junior high, there's a whole street. That very first street is lined with registered sex offenders.
Which, if we take time to let that sink in, isn't that kind of freaky?
Well,
Kind of freaky.
it makes sense because
It,
there are no
it does.
there are no rules that say they can't live within 1,000 feet of a
Right.
school. They can live in the backyard of the school.
I forget how many feet away they have to be, because I remember in Shanksville, where you grew up, I remember when a sex offender moved not too far from us, and I looked it up, and
I think it's 1,000 feet.
yeah, it's not far,
Yeah,
not far.
and 1,000 feet is not very far. That's what, 2 football lengths?
No, yeah, and there they are, and watching none other than children passing by. They know the routine. They know the child. They can identify the children, and it really is mind-boggling and frightening. It really is.
So, again, these are sex offenders. These are people on the registry. 780,000 in the United States, almost 1 million, and those are people who actually went through the process. And Grace has talked about this a lot before. Grace has a lot of good resources on their website. So does Darkness to Light and Rain. They have statistics that show the overwhelming majority of people who get turned in will never face a conviction.
Yeah.
And so, out of those very small handful who do face a conviction, you still have 780,000 of them. And of those 780,000 who are on a sex offender registry, the vast majority of them have zero controls whatsoever. None. They have absolutely no controls, except that they have to keep up with their registry every 6 months. It's a felony, to my understanding, it's a felony in all 50 states. If you don't keep up with your registry, you have to re-register, update your information
But
every 6
like
months.
you said, how many of us check that registry to see who's living?
Probably
by
very
us
few
or
people
whatever?
do.
Yeah, we don't do that.
Very few people
routinely.
do.
Yeah, that's
And so those are who we consider the known sex offenders, and then you have all the unknowns, and there are millions of them. And so the point is, these people are among us. They're here, they're among us, and we cannot count on reporting, having somebody go to prison, they're locked away for the rest of their life, and you never have to see the person again. It doesn't work that way. So,
not at all.
it drives me nuts when people talk about prevention in terms of, well, just report abuse. I did my duty, I reported. No, you did part of your duty. When you reported, you did part of your duty. The bigger part of your duty is to make sure that this person is never around minor children. If it's a pedophile,
the whole thing.
Make sure they're never around
The
children.
whole thing is mind-boggling. It just really is. It feels way too big unless we begin right where we are, one-on-one. Just what's the next best step for me to take? What's the next best step for you to take? What do we do today to help keep a child safe? And when we start thinking that way, when we each take up our little place in life to do that, we make a difference. But when we get afraid of statistics and we just say it's too much, I don't want to hear it, and we sit back, they're counting on us doing that. They really are. They are counting on us feeling overwhelmed and turning a blind eye.
yeah.
And we
Well,
cannot do that.
I mean, the other thing too is, if statistics overwhelm you, that's understandable, but that shouldn't stop you from caring for the children who are within your circle, within your eyesight. You have a responsibility, whether you know those kids or not. When you go out and sit and watch your kids at the playground, you have a responsibility to make sure other kids
Keep
aren't
our
being
eyes
bullied, that they're
Absolutely.
they're not being
Yes.
abused, and on and on and on.
Right.
They're not being kidnapped. You have a responsibility, whether they're your kids or not. You have a responsibility to keep eyes on them
And I
and make
think
sure they're
when we
safe.
start thinking that way, we become more serious about it.
Mm-hmm.
That it's my job to do that today in my little circle. It's your job in your little circle.
Mm-hmm.
You live very close to a school, and you have people cutting through your yard.
Mm-hmm.
You have, walking to and from school, things like that. You have a really big responsibility here
Mm-hmm.
when you think about it. You truly do.
I
You have young children yet in your home. Even bigger responsibility. Keep your eyes and ears open. We all have different responsibilities
mm-hmm.
in the big task of keeping our children safe.
I still remember. I mean, we'll kind of close on this note, but the bystander effect is real, and
It is.
we've got to overcome that. And I remember. I mean, this was years ago, but we got home from church. It was really nice out. We had our door propped open. The screen door was shut, but our living room door was open. And I heard the faintest scream, what I thought was a woman's voice screaming for help. And, like, of course, my mind is racing, and I'm like, well, first of all, did I hear what I really thought I
Yeah,
heard? And
right.
secondly, is she being kidnapped? Is she being, is something worse happening? Like, I didn't know.
Right.
So I asked Natalie if she heard it, and she was like, I didn't hear anything. And I was like, well, come out here on the deck. And we listened, and sure enough, you could hear it again. And it was, I mean, way off in the distance. Just the you could barely hear it. So I jumped on my bike, and I went down, tried to listen to it and follow it. And I went down, and here it was one of our neighbors down on the street below. Her motorcycle had flipped on top of her,
Wow.
and she was trapped underneath this
Wow.
1,000-pound motorcycle. And I was able to lift it up off of her enough that she could get out from under it. And I'll never forget. I mean, she just sobbing.
I'm sure.
And she's like, I've been here for what feels like an eternity. She's like, it probably was about 5 minutes. And she was like, not one of these neighbors came to help. She said people were driving by.
yeah.
She's like, I know they can hear me screaming because all these houses are side by
Real
side. They're
close,
right next to
yeah.
each other. People had their
Right.
windows open because it's summertime. And she's like, here you came from half a mile away. And she's like, I would have laid here all day if you wouldn't have come. And I thought, this is interesting. Like,
Right.
people heard it. I know they heard it. I know
Had
for a
to.
fact
Yeah,
people could
they
hear
had
it.
to. Right. If you heard it clear out here.
Right.
Ooh.
So, it goes back to when you hear somebody cry for help, or you see something that's out of place, or you feel something that doesn't feel right, you step in and you look into it, At a bare minimum, you look into it.
I'm
We have a
shaking my
responsibility
head,
to do
yes,
it.
and we live in such a society that teaches us so opposite.
Mm-hmm.
They'll teach us don't stop if there's a car stopped.
Yeah, because 1 in 500 million people will
Don't
be there
stop
to
and
rob
offer
you.
help. We're taught to look the other way because harm might come to you.
Yep.
If you see somebody crumble down on a sidewalk, you don't know what the problem is, step to the side and just briskly walk on. Society is telling us the exact opposite. And we just by instinct, I think a lot of us, most of us, has been proven, do fall into the bystander effect where we look straight ahead and we just keep rolling.
Yep.
It would have been so easy for you to just dismiss that, especially when Natalie said, I don't hear anything. I don't hear anything.
And to be honest, I thought my mind was playing tricks
Well,
on
sure.
me because I thought I heard it, and then I listened, and I didn't hear it again. And I was like, I must be hearing
Wow.
things because it was so quiet. I mean, it was so
Well, because
quiet.
of the distance.
Right.
Yeah. Wow.
So,
We
it's
need
that
to
kind
do
of thing.
better.
Like,
We need to do better.
we absolutely have to do
Yes,
better.
we do.
There are so many millions of kids, and not just kids. It is not just children, but children are the most vulnerable. There's so many millions right here in the United States every single year, and if you think about that number, millions
Well, with
of
summer
kids are being
coming,
abused.
there will be we'll have a better time to see kids, to view them. Winter is always hard when parents keep kids in. You can't see a whole lot of what's going on unless you're a teacher in school, and teachers have so many opportunities and responsibilities. Churches have so many opportunities and responsibilities to watch our children. Daycare centers, Natalie can tell you, I'm sure.
Yeah.
When you see oddities or you see differences in behavior, whatnot. But we all come in contact with children. Every single one of us do. We need to pay attention.
Yeah.
We truly
Yeah.
do.
Yeah, I think if we do that, it just makes it so much easier and so much easier for us to work together to keep
Our
kids
kids
safe.
are depending on
And
us.
it makes it a lot safer.
Yes.
Yeah, but the point is, my goodness, there are a lot of criminals who are out here on the streets, and those are ones that, again, that we know of. They've been
Right.
convicted. There are millions more who have never gotten caught, and they're here. They're among us. So let's do our part. Let's keep vigilant, keep watching, protect the kids that are in front of you. And then I think the world will be a lot safer place.
Our kids will
Lot
be,
safer
for
place.
sure. Yes.
All right. Well, thank you for tuning into this episode. And as long as none of us get sick,
I know,
we'll see you next
yeah.
week. I noticed you're
Yeah.
not coughing anymore.
I got
so
through this whole session
you must
without
have-
one cough.
you must be doing
I am
better.
so happy. Yes. Yes.
All right. Well, thank you, listeners, and we'll catch you next round.
Thanks again for listening to today's episode. A special thank you to our patrons who make this podcast possible. Please help us get the word out by searching for the Speaking Out on Sex Abuse podcast in your favorite podcast app. Be sure to hit subscribe and rate the show. Please consider supporting the podcast by becoming a patron and check out the rewards our patrons receive.